A dying billionaire begs his humble maid to have circuits with him because I'm not asking for love, but I'm asking for a legacy. He was a billionaire, feared, admired, envied, but at 34, with only 6 months left to live, John had no wife, no child, no one to carry his name. So he turned to the only person who'd stayed through it all. It was Maid, and what he asked of her wasn't just impossible, it was unthinkable. But what if? What if the answer to both their broken hearts wasn't money? It was a child born from compassion. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound filling the vast modern space of John Aldridge's penthouse office. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan glowed with a cold, indifferent brilliance. Inside, a man sat completely still, back cutched, shoulders slumped, a medical report trembling in his hand. John was only 34. A tech billionaire, a boardroom predator, a Wall Street legend. But in this moment he looked like nothing more than a frightened boy. The diagnosis had come that afternoon. Stage 4 cardiac sarcoma, aggressive, inoperable. 6 months. Maybe less. There was no one to call, no wife to hold his hand, no family to fly in, no siblings, no parents. They were long gone or had long since chosen to forget him. His relatives? They only came around when there were trust funds to lobby for. He smiled in his face at galas and cursed his name in inheritance battles. John had everything, but nothing that mattered now. He had built an empire of glass and code, his name etched into skyscrapers and tech patents. But when the machines stopped humming, who would carry his name? That was the part that wrecked him. His legacy would die with him. A soft knock on the door broke the stillness. Mandy entered with a silver tray and a cup of jasmine tea. She had worked for him for 8 years, silent, loyal, unnoticed in the way only the humble could be. He was plain, simple, careful, but she never once made a mistake, and over time John had begun to realize something strange. He was the only person who looked him in the eyes without fear. Not for his money. Not for his power. Just him. Mr. Aldridge? Her voice was soft, hesitant. Are you okay? He should have dismissed her, should have told her to leave. But something inside him broke and stuck. No, he said quietly. And just like that, the dam burst. I'm dying, Mandy. He didn't look at her when he said it, couldn't. He was too afraid she'd run. Or worse. But she didn't run. She simply stood there, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry, she whispered. He finally turned to her. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Mandy, he began, the words rough, shameful on his tongue. I don't have anyone, my relatives are leeches, they'll take everything I've built once I'm gone. He stood, walked to her slowly as if each step cost him breath. I need a child, someone to inherit everything, someone I can leave this world to. Her breath caught in her throat. I need you to carry my child, he said. Please. I know how insane this sounds, but I trust you. You're the only person in my life who's never wanted anything from me, and now I have nothing to offer but the future. So I went. Complete retirement. Mandy's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't just shocked, she was shattered. Her boss, her employer, the man she admired from a careful distance, was asking her not for love, not even companionship, but a child. He couldn't even find his voice. I can't, she finally whispered. John's face twisted in guilt, and he lowered himself into the chair behind him. I'm sorry, he muttered, voice raw. I shouldn't have asked. I just didn't know who else to turn to. She left, quiet. But that night, she didn't sleep, because her heart had stayed behind in that room, croaky for a man who had everything, and no one to hold his hand through the dark. Section 1. The diagnosis. The sterile lights of the private clinic flickered above John Aldridge as he sat alone in the VIP consultation room. Outside, the world moved at its usual breakneck speed. Chauffeurs shouting into phones, executives pacing with coffee in hand, luxury sedans lining the curb. But inside this room, time stood still. Dr. Hastings, an older man with sorrowful eyes, slid a folder across the marble table. His hand lingered on the edge, as if giving John one last chance not to open it. John didn't need to. He had already read the pain in the doctor's eyes the moment he walked in. "Just say it," John whispered, voice hollow. The doctor's lips parted slowly. Stage 4 cardiac sarcoma. Inoperable. Aggressive. Median survival is 4 to 6 months. Without treatment. John's jaw tensed, his breath catching. And with treatment. A few more months perhaps. But the side effects are significant. You'll be weak. John. That phrase, quality of life, was the polite way doctors told you to get your affairs in order. He nodded slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Thank you, doctor." Dr. Hastings hesitated. "You might want to consider palliative care, counselors, hospice when the time comes, and if you have loved ones, it's best." "Got it? I don't got rotunda sepreto." The doctor's face faltered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Aldridge." But John didn't respond. His fingers were already gripping the folder, knuckles white. He stood without another word, adjusted his tailored jacket, and walked out the door. Back in his penthouse, a sleek glass box overlooking Central Park, John collapsed into the leather chair in his office. The city sparkled below him, oblivious to the war waging in his chest. He laid the medical report on the desk, the words blurred together. Malignant tumor origin. Prognosis, recommendation, immediate consultation with oncology and estate attorney. Estate attorney. Of course. The vultures would start circling the moment word got out. He had no children, no wife, no heir. His board would fight over the company. His cousins, leeches in designer suits, would lay claim to the mansion, the patents, the offshore accounts. Everything he'd built from the ground up. Gone. And for what? A few magazine covers? A Forbes list? A seat at a table no one truly wanted him at? He leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling, tears burning behind his eyes but never falling. John Aldridge didn't cry. He hadn't cried since his mother's funeral when he was 17 and his uncle told him coldly, "Don't mourn. Men like us replace grief with gold." That man had been first in line for a loan when he hit his first billion. Now that same man would probably be first in line for John's penthouse, the moment the will went public. But John had outplayed everyone before. He wasn't about to let them take his empire without a fight. That night John opened the drawer where he kept an old yellowed photo, one he hadn't looked at in years. A little boy with shaggy blonde hair sat on his mother's lap. Her eyes were kind, her hands wrapped protectively around his son's waist. She had died too young. Cancer. She never got to see what he became. But she also never saw how bitter he'd become, how many walls he'd built around himself, how much love he'd pushed away in the name of business. No woman had ever gotten past the surface. Not the models, not the heiresses, not the ones who said they understood his world. They understood his bank account. But not him. And now he had 6 months to figure out what a man should do. When everything he had built couldn't go, he closed the drawers. That's when a quiet knock came from the hallway. "Mr. Aldrich," a voice called gently. It was Mandy. Of course, punctual as ever. He cleared his throat, straightened his back. "Come in." She entered in silence, holding a silver tray, a cup of jasmine tea, 2 biscuits, a folded napkin. She always remembered the details. But when she looked at him this time, something shifted. Her eyes narrowed. "Sir, is everything all right?" For a moment John nearly lied. But something in him gave out. He shook his head. "No, not really." He saw it then, the flicker of worry in her soft brown eyes. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just someone who ironed his shirts and polished the floors. He had been with him through every season, through the launch of his second company, through the loss of his dog, through sleepless nights and quiet holidays. And never once had she asked for more than a paycheck. He had seen his world for what it was, and stayed anyway. "Can I do anything?" she asked, placing the tray on the table. He looked up at her. really looked at her, and something inside him clicked. It was no wife, no child, no one to carry his name. But Mandy, she was loyal, she was kind. She was the only person who had never asked for anything, and the only one left who might care enough to say yes. A wild eye began forming in his mind. It was desperate, wicked, possibly unforgivable. But it was also his only chance. He took a shaky breath and whispered, "Mandy, can we talk?" Section 2. The proposition. The room fell silent. Mandy stood frozen, one hand still lightly resting on the handle of the silver tray. The gentle aroma of jasmine tea drifted through the air, untouched. "Mandy," he repeated, slower this time, as if trying to steady the tremor in his voice. "Sit down, please." She blinked, surprised. In all the 8 years she had worked for him, John Aldridge had never once asked her to sit. Not out of arrogance, but because there had always been a quiet wall between them, a line neither of them had dared cross. Until now. She slowly stepped closer and took the edge of the armchair across from him. The silence between them stretched, heavy with things unsaid. He studied her face, kind, patient, a woman used to hiding her emotions in the background, and yet tonight her eyes were wide with quiet concern. "I need to tell you something," he said, resting his hands on the edge of the armrest, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Something I haven't told anyone else." Mandy said nothing, only nodded, waiting. "I'm dying." The words landed with a dull thud. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. He saw it then, how much she felt, even when she hid it. "I went to see the doctor today," he continued, voice rasping. "It's cancer. Aggressive, inoperable. 6 months, maybe less." He covered her mouth as if trying to stop the gasp that escaped. No, that can't." "I'm not okay," he said, cutting gently. "Not anymore. And I've come to terms with it. Mostly." A silence again. She lowered her hand and blinked quickly, the corners of her eyes pink. "I'm not telling you this to scare you," he added, "but because I need to ask you something. Something that may—" She leaned in, heart thudding in her chest. John turned to face her directly. His next words came slowly, each syllable laced with guilt, hope. "I need an heir, Mandy. Someone to carry on my name. Someone I can trust. I know this will sound like I've lost my mind, but—" He exhaled, looking away, then back at her. "I want you to carry my child." The air vanished from the room. Mandy's mouth fell open slightly, as if her brain couldn't register what she'd just heard. What?" "I don't have anyone else," he said. "My family, what little I had, used me for years. My board of directors is already circling like wolves. I've built this empire from nothing, and now it'll be torn apart the moment I'm gone. I don't want that." Mandy stood up, shaking her head slightly. "Mr. John, you're asking me—" "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for romance. Just legacy. A child. I'll provide for you, for the baby. You'll never want for anything. And when I'm gone, everything, my estate, the company, the trust, will be yours and the child's." Mandy couldn't speak. Her hands trembled at her sides. "Amy," she finally managed, voice hoarse. "Because you're the only person I trust," he said simply. "You've never asked for anything, never taken advantage of me. You've been loyal, kind. You've seen me at my worst. And you're the only person in this world who's ever stayed." Tears brimmed in Mandy's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. This isn't just a business proposal, Mr. John. This is a life, a soul, a child. You're asking me to bring a life into the world without love, without—" "I know," he said quietly, "and I wouldn't blame you for walking out of here and never speaking to me again." He turned away, her heart pounding in her ears. John lowered his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not trying to trap you. If you say no, I'll never mention this again. I just—" The pain in his voice cracked something inside her. She thought of the little moments, the way he had once sat in silence beside her after her mother died, never saying a word, just letting her cry, the anonymous donations when her sister needed surgery, the nights he wandered the halls, sleepless, but never scolded her for being there. He had always been a storm, yes, but in the quiet corners he had a soul. Mandy turned back to I need time, she said at last, barely audible. I can't answer you tonight. John nodded, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. Of course. As she turned to leave, he added gently, Mandy, thank you for even listening. That night, Mandy lay awake staring at the ceiling. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across her tiny room. Her hands rested on his chest as if to slow the thundering beat of her heart. He wasn't afraid of motherhood. He was afraid of giving her heart away and not being able to take it back. Because deep down, beneath the quiet uniform, beneath years of service and routine, she had always seen him. And maybe, just maybe, some small part of her had always loved him. Section 3. The answer. The next morning arrived like a whisper. Soft light spilled into the servants' quarters, bathing the room in a pale golden glow. But Mandy hadn't slept. Her eyes were open before the alarm buzzed. She sat up slowly, legs dangling over the side of the bed, bare feet brushing against the cold floor. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her robe. The events of the night before replayed in her mind with relentless precision. His voice, his eyes, the vulnerability in a man she once thought untouchable. He walked to the mirror and stared at his reflection. Same uniform, same eyes, same woman, but everything inside her had changed. Down the hall, John sat alone in the breakfast nook. He hadn't touched his coffee. The once strong grip of his hands now looked frail, the veins more visible, his posture slightly sunken. But his eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds, waiting. For her. He had prepared himself for silence, for avoidance, for her to disappear completely like everyone else had. So when she stepped into the doorway, his breath caught. Mandy stood there in her simple maid uniform, her hair pulled back in its usual bun. But something in her eyes was different, clearer, steadier. "But John," she said gently. He stood slower than usual, the fatigue weighing on him. "Mandy, you don't have to say anything, I understand. I'm not here to walk away." He stooped. "I didn't sleep," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking about what you said, about what you're facing, about what you're asking." He walked closer, but still kept a respectful distance. "I was angry at first," she said, "not because of what you asked, but because I didn't understand how you could think I was the right person. I'm nobody, John. I'm just a maid." "No," he said firmly, voice raspy. "You're not just anything." She swallowed hard. "And then I remembered all the times you looked out for me, without ever asking for anything in return. The way you protected me, paid for things without telling me, showed up in small, quiet ways." She paused. "And I realized maybe I've been looking at this all wrong." He stepped closer now, the distance between them narrowing. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy but unafraid. "You're not asking me to sleep with you. You're asking me to help you finish something, to leave something behind that matters." His breath trembled. "Mandy, I'll do it." The words were clear, steady, unwavering. John stared at her as if she'd just handed him another chance at life. You will." She nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips despite the storm of emotion in her chest. "But not because I owe you, and not just because you're dying. I'm doing this because I believe in the man I've seen when no one else was watching." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then John exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry months of fear and loneliness with it. He stepped forward and gently took her hands in his. "You have no idea what this means to me," he whispered. He gripped his hands tighter. "We'll figure it out together." That night, Mandy sat on the edge of her bed again, this time with her heart pounding for an entirely different reason. She had said yes. Not to love, not to a fairy tale, but to something quiet and brave. And terrifying. 2 days. "It's all here," he said, sitting across from her in the study. "A new will, a trust, property in your name, health care, legal guardianship, financial security, everything for the baby, for you." Mandy looked down at the documents, then back at him. "I didn't say yes because I wanted money, John." "I know," he said softly. But I don't want you or our child left with nothing when I'm gone." The words, "our child," hit her like a wave. She nodded, unable to speak. Their first night together wasn't what she feared. He didn't touch her like a man claiming a debt. He touched her like a man saying goodbye to the parts of himself that had been locked away far too long. It was slow, gentle, vulnerable, and when she cried, because she had never given herself to anyone before, he held her, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You're safe." And she believed him. 3 weeks later, Mandy stood frozen in the bathroom. The test in her hand showed 2 unmistakable pink lines. Her knees buckled and she sat on the edge of the tub, one hand covering her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. It was pregnant. It was real. The door creaked open, and John's voice. He stepped out slowly, the test still in her hand. "John." Her voice cracked. His breath hitched. His face softened. He reached out and wrapped her in his arms, holding her like a man holding on to the last dream he'd ever have. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, "for giving me something to live for, even now." From that day forward, everything shifted. Mandy no longer wore her uniform. He no longer knocked before entering his room. They had crossed an invisible line, and somehow the air between them felt safer now, like home. He read books to her belly at night. She sang softly while she folded baby clothes he'd ordered without telling her. They laughed more, cried more, and somewhere between the tears and the late-night whispers, a strange, quiet love began to bloom. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that grows in the stillness, rooted in truth, watered by time, succession. The house had grown quieter over the last few weeks, not from absence. Gone were the clattering sounds of staff rushing from room to room, or the clipped, businesslike rhythm of calls and board meetings. Instead, the mansion now hummed with soft melodies from the old record player in John's study. The scent of chamomile tea and fresh linens lingered in the halls. Life had slowed but not faded. Mandy had begun keeping a journal. Not just any journal, but a leather-bound one John had once used for his investment notes. Now its pages held a different kind of wealth. Her thoughts, her fears, tiny drawings of dreams she didn't yet dare speak aloud. At the top of one page, in careful cursive, she'd written, "I felt something today, not just nerves, a flutter, like butterfly wings inside me." She paused, pen trembling slightly as emotion bloomed behind her ribcage. That morning, John had been particularly weak. Mandy found him asleep on the Chase lounge in the sunroom, the morning light streaking across his face like gold thread on aged parchment. His breaths were shallow, but his hand reached instinctively toward her voice the moment she whispered his name. "Right here," she said, kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open. "You always are." He looked at her belly, barely rounded but enough to hint at the future. "Do you think they'll have your eyes?" he asked. He smiled. "I hope so. Yours have too much mischief." He chuckled weakly. "It's how I closed million-dollar deals. Chong. Coffee." Then his smile softened, gaze resting fully on her. But with he... Later that day, Mandy stood in the kitchen chopping strawberries when it happened. The sensation was unlike anything she'd ever known. A soft ripple, a sudden shift inside her body, like a secret knock from within. He froze, a hand to her belly. Another flood out. And then, stoop. But the afterglow remained. She gasped, a laugh bubbling up through her lips, half tears, half joy. He dropped the knife and rang. John was in his study again, sorting through old letters and deeds. The task had become both distraction and closure, but before he could place the final envelope into the shredder, Mandy burst in. He turned in surprise. "Mandy." He was breathless, flushed. "John, I felt it." "What?" He grabbed his hand and pressed it to her belly. "Just now, the baby. They moved." He blinked, stunned, then laughed. "Amuste." She shook her head. "You'll feel it soon, but I wanted you to know. Our child is really..." John swallowed hard. He had lived a life of numbers, predictions, and forecasts. But nothing. That night, as the house dimmed and silence settled in, Mandy curled up beside him on the oversized couch. He rested his head gently against her shoulder, hand lightly placed on his stomach, waiting. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what kind of father you would have been if things had been different?" He was quiet for a long time. "I used to think I'd be like my father, cold, absent, too busy chasing success to notice what really matters." "And put you out." He looked at her. "I want to be the kind of man who fights to stay, just long enough to tell our child I love them, even if it's only once, even if it's just a whisper." Mandy blinked away tears. "You already are, John." 2 days later, the lawyer returned. John had called him again, not to revise the will, but to add something. A letter, handwritten, sealed with wax. "To my child for when they're old enough to ask, why didn't I get to know my father?" Mandy found it tucked in the baby's first drawer days later. She didn't open it. She couldn't. Instead, she sat by John's bedside that night and asked, "Do you regret never marrying?" He looked over, a thin smile on his lips. "Not anymore." One evening, a soft storm rolled over the hills behind the estate. Rain tapped gently on the windows as thunder rumbled like a distant memory. Mandy was lying across the bed, John beside her, when he placed a warm hand on her belly again. They waited. Damn it, there was another flare-up, then a soft bump beneath the surface. "She's kicking," Mandy whispered, eyes wide with awe. John's fingers trembled as he felt it too. She nodded. "I don't know how I know, but I do." His eyes welled. He closed them tightly, then kissed her belly. "My daughter," he whispered. Over the next few weeks, the nursery slowly came to life. Not with bright cartoon wallpaper or garish pink bows, but with books, woven blankets, a single rocking chair beside a window that caught the morning light. Mandy spent her afternoons there, humming softly, stitching initials into a baby onesie. When John asked what the initials meant, she smiled quietly. "Your name and mine combined." He kissed his forehead. "You've given me more than I deserve." "No," she said, "you gave me more than anyone else ever did." But as life stirred within her, death whispered louder. Jan's health declined sharply that month. He now needed help just to walk from his bed to the window. Mandy refused to leave his side. When he coughed, she brought tea. When he shivered, she climbed into bed and held him. When he wept silently in the dark, she kissed his hand and reminded him he was loved. And one quiet morning, as the wind rustled through the lavender in the garden and Mandy dozed beside him, John whispered. He felt her again. Mandy stirred. "What?" He smiled. And for the first time in a long time, he looked at peace, and 5 letters in the drawer. The early morning sun spilled into the master bedroom with a quiet reverence, painting everything in gold. The mahogany bed frame, the pale linen curtains, and John's gaunt but smiling face. Mandy sat on the edge of the bed, carefully feeding him spoonfuls of porridge. He had barely the strength to hold a spoon anymore. His once powerful hands, the ones that had sealed billion-dollar deals, now trembled with each breath. But his eyes, they were clear, still sharp, still watching her with the same depth of gratitude that had grown each day. "Do you ever wonder," he said softly, "what our daughter will be like?" Mandy smiled faintly, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. "She'll have your eyes," she said, curious, deep, a little too observant. "And your stubbornness," he added with a smirk. He chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sorrow. "Poor thing's already kicking like she owns the place." His gaze fell to her belly, now visibly round. "That's my..." He exhaled a shaky breath, then looked away. "Mandy..." He tilted her head. "What is it?" "In the second drawer of the desk, bottom right. There's a box. It's time you opened it." The desk was older than most of the house. It had belonged to John's grandfather, one of the few family members he ever spoke about without bitterness. Mandy had dusted it 100 times over the years, but had never dared open the bottom drawer. It had always been locked, sacred. Now, with John watching her from the bed, she knelt beside it and slid in the small brass key he handed her. Click. Inside was a simple wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, polished, worn at the corners. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it and brought it to the bed. John nodded toward it. Open it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, neatly tied in bunches with string, some in envelopes, others folded carefully with initials on the outside, and at the very top, a sealed envelope with her name in his handwriting, Mandy. Her throat tightened. I wrote those over the past few months, he said, in case I didn't make it long enough to say the words. She clutched the envelope to her chest. I'm not ready to read it. You don't have to, not now, but they're yours. Yours and hers. There's one for every birthday, one for her wedding, one for when she loses her first tooth. I needed her to know me. Somehow, Mandy could no longer hold back her tears. They fell silently, soaking into the bed sheets as she gripped his hand. He gave her more than most fathers ever will. I gave her you, he whispered. Later that evening, she sat by the nursery window, the box of letters beside her lap, unopened. Outside, dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold. The wind carried the scent of magnolia and memory. She untied the string from the stack marked "To my daughter, age 1, and stared at the handwriting. Dear Aiden, by now you're probably drooling everywhere and babbling in a language only your mother understood. He closed it before finishing. It was too much. Too soon. But the letters were proof of love, of thought, of a man who knew his time was short and still chose to leave traces of himself in ink and paper. That night, John had a harder time breathing. His lungs rattled, his skin looked gray. Mandy didn't sleep. She stayed by his side, reading to him from an old collection of poems he used to keep on his shelf. When his hand found hers, she paused. Do you know what I regret the most, he asked. Did it find you sooner? That I wasted so many years surrounded by people who smiled with knives in their pockets, and I never once stopped to notice the woman cleaning up their messes. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. You saw me when it mattered. He closed his eyes. Promise me one thing, Mandy. You'll let her read the letters, all of them, even the messy ones. I promise. 2 days later, the fever came. It rose fast, hot, unrelenting, stealing his strength by the hour. The doctor came. Then the hospice nurse. By the third night, John could no longer speak. Mandy read aloud from the letter he wrote for their daughter's 10th birthday, tears streaming silently. And if you're anything like your mother, then you already have more strength in your little finger than I had in my whole life. He passed away before dawn, not with fanfare or final speeches, but with Mandy's hand in his, the box of letters tucked beside his bed, and the smallest of smiles on his lips. He kissed him goodbye with more love than any wedding altar could ever sanctify. A month later, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. The nursery now had more color. A mobile spun slowly over the crib. The bookshelves were filling up. The rocking chair creaked as Mandy sat with her growing belly, one hand resting gently over her child. He had moved John's portrait into the nursery. Not the oil painting from the corporate office, the one where he looked like a cold conqueror in a designer suit. No, he chose the candid photo she had taken one afternoon in the garden. He was laughing, barefoot, holding a daisy he picked for her. He looked human. He placed one of the unopened letters into a small wooden chest beside the crib, labeled in her handwriting, "For when you're ready, from death." Because Mandy knew, love like John's didn't end at death. It waited in paper. It whispered from pages. It lived on, long after the man who wrote it was gone. Section The Inheritance Clause. The rain had stopped just before the service ended. The funeral was simple, just as John had wanted. No lavish affair, no celebrity-studded display of wealth, just a quiet garden ceremony beneath the weeping willow. he once said reminded him of his mother. Mandy stood beneath a black umbrella, a hand resting protectively on her belly, as the last handful of soil hit the polished casket. If she didn't cry, if she had cried enough. Now she was steel-wrapped in sorrow, grieving, yes, but fiercely protective of the child growing inside her. John's child, their daughter, the only thing left of him. But even as the mourners left, there was one face that lingered near the back of the gathering, watching with too much interest and too little compassion. It was Evelyn Langford, John's cousin, cold, elegant, with sharp cheekbones and eyes like polished glass. She hadn't spoken to John in nearly a decade, but she was here now. Mandy felt her skin prickle. 3 days later, Mandy received a call from Gregory Walters, John's longtime attorney. "We need you to come in, Mandy, to go over the will." He nodded silently over the phone. She'd been expecting this. But nothing could have prepared her for what waited behind the heavy oak doors of Walters & Klein law firm. Mandy sat in a stiff leather chair across from Gregory, her belly making it hard to get comfortable. Her fingers played nervously with the hem of her coat. Across the table sat Evelyn Langford, dressed in a pristine navy suit, her lips pursed in polite disapproval. Next to her sat Philip Langford, John's second cousin, a bloated man with a Rolex and the smug face of someone who assumed the world owed him something. "You were just the help," he had whispered to her in the hallway when she arrived. "Don't get any ideas." Gregory cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. "We're here to execute the final will and testament of Mr. John Mathers." He read through the formalities first. His estate's valuation, $1.2 billion, the charitable foundations, the dissolution of unused assets. Then Gregory paused. The tension thickened in the room. In this most recent and legally binding version of the will, signed, notarized, and filed 2 weeks before Mr. Mathers's death, the entirety of his liquid assets, primary properties, business holdings, and trust funds are to be transferred to Amanda Grace Wells. Evelyn's face twitched. In trust for the benefit of her unborn child, to be held in full until said child reaches the age of 25, unless deemed capable earlier by a board of appointed trustees. Philip leaned forward. "Excuse me? What the hell are you saying?" Gregory continued calmly. "Miss Wells is to retain full custodial control and power of attorney until that time. The child, as named in the will, is the sole heir." "She's not even family," Evelyn spat. "You expect us to believe he left everything to his maid?" Gregory didn't flinch. He left it to his daughter. A stunned silence fell over the room. Back at the mansion, Mandy sat alone in the nursery. The letters were still untouched, but they felt heavier now, like shields against the judgment already burrowing her way. The phone buzzed. She hesitated, then a clipped voice. "Miss Wells, this is Douglas Fry, representing the Langford estate. My clients are contesting the will. Expect to receive a summons shortly." Then a cluck. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. The next day, a news article appeared online. "Billionaire leaves entire fortune to Maid. Family calls it a scam." The photo was beneath the headline, not one she approved. An old staff photo with her hair pinned back and shadows under her eyes. Below it, a caption. "Former servant Amanda Wells faces questions about paternity and manipulation." He stared at the screen in disbelief. Manipulate? John was the one who asked her. He had refused at first. She never asked for a penny. And now they painted her as a gold digger. She met Gregory at the law firm later that afternoon. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Can they take this away?" He removed his glasses and sighed. "It's not likely. The will is airtight. But he planned for this," Mandy whispered. "I know," he said gently, "but the public doesn't care about truth. They care about narrative." Mandy stood in the garden that night, under the weeping willow. He placed her hand over her belly. "They're going to fight this," she whispered to the wind. "They want what should be yours, and I won't let them take it." He walked back into the house with a new resolve. He was no longer the maid in the shadows. He was the mother of his child, and that meant she was the keeper of his legacy. Section 7. The marble floor beneath Mandy's heels felt colder than usual. He stood in the grand foyer of the Mathers estate. No, her estate now, staring up at the oil-painted portraits that lined the tall wood-paneled walls. John's ancestors stared down at her, governors, captains of industry, men who had shaped the very bones of this country. None of them looked like her. He took a slow breath. Your voice, I don't belong here, a voice whispered in her head. But she silenced it, because now she wasn't just a maid walking on marble. She was a mother protecting what was hers, what was John's, what would be Aidan's. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard a knock. Not the polite knock of the housekeeper, or the soft tap of a friend. It was insistent, sharp, legal. Her chest tightened. Gregory Walters was already waiting for her at the door, his expression grave. They've filed the challenge. Bad? She asked quietly. Bad, he replied. They've hired a team, Langford, Meyer and Dunn, the top trust litigation firm in the state. Their entire argument rests on proving your child is not John's biological heir. Mandy's fingers gripped the doorframe. But the will, they're attacking its foundation, claiming John was manipulated, not of sound mind, under emotional duress. Gregory stepped closer. They've subpoenaed medical records, and they've requested a paternity test. Her throat dried. I haven't even had the baby yet. They know, Gregory said, but they want your consent to test. Pre-birth through amniocentesis. It's invasive, risky. Mandy touched her stomach instinctively. I won't put my baby in danger for their greed. Gregory gave a solemn nod. Then we prepare for war. That night she found herself wandering again, this time into John's private study. She hadn't been in this room since the funeral. The faint scent of cedar and old paper still clung to the air. His chair sat pushed back slightly, as if he'd just risen moments ago. On impulse, Mandy sat down. The leather was still molded to his frame. He pulled open the desk drawers slowly, first empty, then stationery, then documents. But something caught her eye in the back of the last one. A small velvet pouch. Inside it, a silver pocket watch, and an envelope, yellowed at the edges. To my daughter. If I never get to meet you. Her fingers trembled. She unfolded the letter. If you're reading this, it means time got the best of me. But if you exist, if Mandy is holding this letter and you are safe within her, then I died knowing I left something beautiful behind. They will fight you, not because they care about me, but because of what I left behind. Power, money, and those things poison people. But blood tells the truth. You are mine. You will carry my name, not because of a court order or a DNA test, but because I have loved you since the moment I dared to hope you existed. I have left proof of everything. Gregor knows where, and if ever they come for you, remember this. Blood may be tested in court, but legacy lives in the heart. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I knew peace for the first time when she said yes. Your father. Mandy pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed. Not for the money, not even for the child, but because in that moment John felt alive again. The next morning Gregory arrived with news. I think it's time we used what John left behind. He put a manila folder on the table. Before he died, John had his DNA stored and certified by a third-party lab, sealed, notarized, and filed through his private physician. Not because of fear, because he knew they'd come. Mandy's eyes widened. There's more, Gregory said. He also recorded a video, addressed to the court. Do you want to see it? Mandy hesitated, then nodded. Greg Gupa, you appeared on screen, pale, hollowed eyes, but dignified. If you're watching this, I'm gone. But let me be clear. Mandy Wells did not manipulate me, she did not seduce me. She saved me. I asked her for something no woman should ever be asked, and she said no, not because she was cruel, but because she was kind. Once she said yes, it was not for money. It was for love. A kind of love that isn't flashy or loud. A kind of love I never deserved. To the court. If you challenge my will, then challenge me. Not her, not my child. Do your tests. Look at your charts. But understand this. My final act on this earth was not written with trembling hands. It was written with clarity, with peace, and with the full knowledge that what I leave behind is not wealth, it is truth. The video ended. Mandy wiped her eyes. Do you think it will hold in court? Gregory nodded yes, but they won't stop there. They'll try to tear your name apart. He straightened. Let them Later that week, a court hearing was scheduled. As Mandy entered the courtroom, a sea of cameras flashed outside. News anchors, reporters, scandal chasers, all hungry for the drama of the maid who stole a billion-dollar legacy. But Mandy walked in, head high, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. She wore a simple black dress, a soft pendant around her neck. Not a gold digger. Not a victim. A mother. A widow in all but name. He took her seat beside Gregory, ignoring Evelyn's glare from across the aisle. When the judge called the session to order, Mandy glanced up at the ceiling of the courtroom. Ornate marble, carved with scenes of justice. Blood in the marble, she thought. Jan's blood. Their child's future. Her battle now. And she would not let them take it. Section 8, the cross-examination. The courtroom was too bright. Official. Clinical. 100 eyes pressed in on Mandy from the gallery behind her, and yet the only eyes she could feel were Evelyn's. John's cousin burned through her like acid from across the aisle. Mandy sat still, hands folded over her belly. The judge adjusted his glasses, papers shuffled. The legal team for the estate's challengers, Evelyn and the bloodline jackals, had pulled no punches. And today, they would cross-examine her. Gregory leaned in. They'll come hard. Mandy nodded. She was ready to be bruised. But she would not break. The opposing counsel stood, tall, pressed navy suit, cold eyes. Moiselles, he said, voice rich with practiced control. You were employed as a maid in Mr. Mather's estate for 8 years, is that correct? Yes, Mandy said evenly. During which time you maintained a strictly professional relationship? I did. Until he asked you to bear his child's. The courtroom seemed to exhale as one. Mandy didn't flinch. Yes. The lawyer paced. You admit then that Mr. Mathers made this request while terminally ill, vulnerable, emotionally distressed? Yes, she said. And you agreed, knowing full well he had no remaining heirs, that you and the child you carried would inherit an empire. Mandy sat straighter. No. I agreed because he was alone, because he wanted something real before he died, not for an empire. There was a pause. The lawyer's lips curved in something close to a sneer. Wells, how much money did Mr. Mathers give you before you became pregnant? It was none, he repeated, disbelief dripping. Not even gifts? Jewelry, a car, a necklace? He gave me a necklace, she said, with a lily pendant, not worth more than $50. The courtroom was still. That detail, so small, so intimate, landed like a stone in water. But the lawyer wasn't done. Let's talk about the night you conceived. Gregory stood. Objection, Your Honor, rob-a-fucking dignity. The judge raised a brow. Where is this going, counselor? I intend to show this was a manipulative act by the witness, not a consensual one of emotional sincerity. We question the authenticity of the child's paternity. The judge nodded. Proceed carefully. The lawyer stepped closer. Ms. Wells, was this your first time being intimate with a man? Mandy's cheeks flushed, but she refused to drop her gaze. Oh, and yet you made this choice, with a dying billionaire, without coercion. Yes, she said again, because he didn't take. He asked and I said no at first, but later I said yes, because I loved him. A murmur rippled behind her. One woman in the audience quietly dabbed her eyes. The lawyer switched tact. Let's discuss the DNA. You've refused a pre-birth paternity test. Is that correct? Yes, because it's risky. I won't endanger the baby. So you're withholding key evidence that could disprove this entire claim. And protecting my child. Or protecting your story. Gregory stood. Objection. Badgering. The judge nodded. Sustained. Then came the worst part. The lawyer pulled out a grainy photo, blew it up on the screen. It was Mandy, in the garden, kneeling beside John, his head in her lap, her hand on his hair. This was taken 3 weeks before his death. You look comfortable, Ms. Wells, intimate. Would you say you fell in love with your employer while he was dying? I fell in love with him long before I let myself admit it. Silence. Then her voice cracked, but didn't falter. I loved him when he paid for my brother's surgery without ever telling me. I loved him when he left groceries at my door during Christmas. I loved him because he never asked for anything in return, until the day he asked for hope. Greg Gaughy rose for He moved slowly, purposefully. Wells, did John Mathers ever threaten you? No. Did he ever offer you money in exchange for carrying his child? Did he leave you the estate because you demanded it? No, she said, her voice steady now. He left it because he believed in family. And in the end, I was the only family he had. Greggy stepped closer. And finally, Ms. Wells, when he died, what were his last words to you? She closed her eyes. You're my peace, Mandy. A silence settled over the courtroom like snowfall. Outside the courthouse that evening, the press waited. But Mandy didn't. She held her belly, walked past them all, and climbed into the waiting car. Did we win? She asked Gregory quietly. We gave them something they didn't expect, he replied. What? The truth, and sometimes not more dangerous than any lie. Session 9, the Cradle and the Courtroom. The hospital room was quiet, eerily so, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Mandy lay still in the hospital bed, drenched in sweat, one arm cradling the newborn on her chest. The other clutched the thin bedsheet, still shaking from the force of labor. Outside, the sun was barely rising, casting a golden glow across the pale linoleum floor. A nurse gently adjusted the baby blanket, her voice soft. You did beautifully, Ms. Wells. He's perfect. Mandy didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the little face nestled against her heart. A boy, pink-cheeked, peaceful, breathing softly. Aiden. John said. They were saying, but there was no time for wonder, no time for tears of joy, because in 3 hours she had to return to court. Downstairs, Gregory was pacing. The hospital lobby buzzed with movement, nurses, coffee carts, the usual morning rhythm, but all he could think about was the storm outside that had nothing to do with weather. Evelyn's team had filed an emergency motion. They were contesting the child's birth certificate. They claimed the baby wasn't John's, that Mandy had fabricated the story. She'd seduced a dying man for wealth. And unless they could prove otherwise, by noon the will would be frozen. The inheritance would be held. The baby, Aiden, would have no legal claim to his father's name. Gregory checked his watch, then looked up toward the maternity ward. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. This was worse. Back in the hospital room, Mandy whispered softly to Aiden, her voice thick with emotion. They want to erase you, before you've even opened your eyes to the world. Her fingers traced the curve of his cheek. But you're real. You're his, and I will fight for you, baby, even if it breaks me. She barely had time to shower, barely had time to breathe. By 10:15 a.m. she was standing once again on the witness stand, this time weaker, her hospital wristband still wrapped around her arm, her steps slow from the birth she had endured just hours before. Gasps rippled through the gallery as she entered. But Mandy walked tall. Behind her stood Gregory. Beside him, a pediatric nurse, holding Aiden. Evelyn stood too, her eyes narrowing like a hawk circling prey. Your Honor, she said smoothly, this is pure theatrics, designed to manipulate the court's emotions. There is no proof this child is my cousin's. Gregory replied, Your Honor, with respect, the theatrics here belong to the people trying to rob a child of his birthright. The judge looked at Mandy. Was a first qualifier. Wells, are you prepared to testify given your condition? I am, she said. Are you certain? She held her chin high. I just brought his son into this world. I can bring the truth into this courtroom." Greggy took the floor. "Wells," he began gently, "you gave birth this morning. Why are you here instead of resting?" "Because they're trying to take his name from my son," she said, her voice clear, "and if I don't speak now, they'll rewrite a story that doesn't belong to them." He nodded, then passed her a photo. "You recognize this?" Tears welled in her eyes. Yes, John took it himself. It was the first time he felt Aiden care. It showed John's thin hand right up his belly, a soft smile on his pale face. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't strategy. It was love. Real. Gaukin. Then Gregory turned to the nurse. "Can you confirm the child born this morning is the same child referenced in the prenatal records tied to Ms. Wells?" The nurse nodded yes. "Yes, same due date, same medical charts. Everything aligns." But Ividalia wasn't finished. She stood, papers in hand. "We have video surveillance," she said coldly. 2 weeks before Mr. Mathers passed, Mandy was seen accepting a gift, an expensive box possibly containing jewelry. If this was such a pure relationship, why accept gifts? Gregory turned to Mandy. "What was in the box?" Mandy smiled softly, brokenly. "A ring," she said. The courtroom stirred. "He gave me a promise ring, not for marriage, but to remind me that we were family, that he loved me, that he wanted to be remembered." Gregory handed the ring to the clerk. The judge leaned in to examine it. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy. It was rare. Then came the final move. The paternity test had been submitted via cord blood, processed post-birth with emergency approval. The bailiff entered the room with a sealed envelope. Gregory he looked to the judge. "May the court open this?" The judge nodded. Carefully he unfolded the paper. Beep. Been 99.97% paternal match. The courtroom erupted. Mandy gasped. The nurse holding Aiden smiled through tears. Gregory closed his eyes. Evelyn sat back like a deflated balloon, her face pale. The judge's gavel echoed sharply. "This court recognizes Aiden Mathers as the legitimate heir to Jonathan Elias Mathers' estate and legacy. Case closed." Outside, the world had changed. Mandy stepped into the sun, Aiden pressed against her chest. Camera flashes burst, reporters shouted questions. But she didn't answer. Not today. Instead, she walked to the black car waiting at the curb. Gregory opened the door for her. "You did it," he said. She nodded. "No," she whispered. "We did." As the car pulled away, she held Aiden close. "Your daddy fought for the world," she murmured, "but I fought for you, and now the world knows you belong." And for the first time in weeks, Mandy smiled. Not as a maid, not as a witness, but as a mother, as a woman who dared to carry a billionaire's final wish. And Section 10. The letter she never sent. The wind that morning carried the scent of lilacs. It swept through the open windows of the master suite at Lily Hill, stirring the pale curtains and brushing over the mahogany desk where Mandy now sat, alone. Oanguadon was napping in the next room, his tiny fists curled up beside his flushed cheeks, unaware that the world outside continued to turn without his father. Gon had been gone for 17 days. 17 days since she found him still, his fingers curled near her pillow like he had been reaching for her. 17 mornings without hearing his gravelly voice ask. He hadn't touched the desk since. Not until now. He sat slowly like someone entering a chapel. Her hands trembled as she pulled the drawer open. Inside, the smell of his cologne still lingered. Cedarwood and something crisp, like winter. There were the usual things, old business cards, cufflinks, the watch he stopped wearing when the chemo made his wrist ache. But beneath a stack of unused stationery, her fingers brushed something different. An envelope. Yellowed slightly at the edges. Sealed, with her name written on the front in his sharp, deliberate handwriting. Mandy, to be opened only if I never get the courage. Her breath caught. She hesitated, fingers hovering. Hadn't she mourned enough? But something deeper, Something ancient and female and aching pushed her to open it. "But you'll probably find this when I'm gone." Because I'd always been better at planning empires than speaking feelings. "I want to say what I never had the courage to tell you in person, not because I didn't feel it, but because I felt it so deeply I didn't think I deserved to. I asked you to carry my child, but what I really wanted, it was for he was to stay. You made me laugh when I forgot how. You argued with me when no one else dared. You reminded me of who I was before power corrupted me. And slowly, you became the only thing I looked forward to. I know it wasn't a fair request. I know I asked too much. But in those final weeks, it wasn't the company or the court battles or even my name that mattered. It was you. I loved you, Mandy. I never said it. I never let myself say it. But if you're reading this, know that you were the only part of my life that was ever real. Yours." The letter slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor. He doubled over in the chair, sobs racking through her body like a dam had finally broken. He had loved her, and he had died thinking she might never know. All the years they'd spent orbiting around each other, caught between roles and titles and rules. All the silent looks, all the evenings by his bedside, the laughter between bites of soup, the kiss on her hand before he drifted to sleep. He had been too afraid to name it, and he had been too ashamed to believe he deserved it. But in the end, love had been there to quiet the unspoken, and now it lived on in her son. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Not for court, not for documents, for her son. She began to write. "John, you said you were better at empires than feelings. Me too. But tonight I'm going to try. Because I loved you too. I loved you in the silences, in the way you handed me tea instead of orders, in the way you gave me a life without asking for anything in return. You changed me. I wish we had more time. I wish I had told you sooner. But know this, our son would grow up knowing he was born not out of obligation, but out of hope. You thought your legacy would be your fortune. But your real legacy is love." He didn't send the letter, of course. He folded it gently and placed it beside his, in the drawer. "New letter. Too heartened. It find out." The next morning Mandy awoke early. He walked barefoot across the marble floors to the nursery. Aiden stirred as she lifted him from the crib, his sleepy eyes blinking open. "Good morning, baby," she whispered. He smiled, curling into her chest. The morning light danced across the room, catching on the sapphire ring on her hand and the silver lily necklace at her throat. But Mandy walked to the balcony with him, holding him close as they looked out over the estate. "Daddy loved this view," she whispered into his hair. Aiden gurgled softly, resting a hand against her heart. And for the first time since John's death, Mandy didn't feel alone. He felt that. Downstairs, Gregory waited in the drawing room. He held a small box. "From John's personal vault," he said, handing it over. And inside was a Lily Hill. He signed over not to the company, not to the board, but to Aiden. And in John's skull, for the only home he ever knew. Mandy closed the box, tears rising. There sorted more than land. He had roots. He had love. He had the legacy of Lily Hill. The seasons changed gently at Lily Hill. Where once the silence of death had lingered like fog, now there was laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles echoing down the marble halls. Aiden had learned his first word, Mama, and then shortly after, Dada, as he touched the portrait of John above the fireplace, his tiny fingers pressed to the glass like he knew him. Mandy stood by the window, arms folded around herself, watching the boy run barefoot through the garden. The lilies had bloomed early this spring, the same white ones that once lined the walkways where she used to carry tea to a man who never smiled. Lily Hill was no longer just an estate. It had become a sanctuary, a place where loss had transformed him to legacy, where a dying man's final wish had become a living woman's greatest strength. The world remembered him as a billionaire. But she remembered the man. The one who brought her soup when she had the flu. Who wept at the sound of a heartbeat on a hospital monitor. Who wore guilt like armor and love like a secret. The world could have his numbers. He kept his essence. Aiden was nearly 2 now, and one sunny afternoon as Mandy sat beside the fountain in the courtyard, she opened a worn leather box. Inside were scattered thoughts, sketches, even short letters he never sent, notes like, "She laughs like rain on glass, unexpected, soft, and impossible to ignore. If I die tomorrow, I want her to know she gave me more peace than all my wealth combined." Each word was a thread stitching closed the wounds of doubt she'd carried. For so long she'd wondered, was it love or pity? Was she just a means to an end? But this journal, this quiet testimony of a man in love, erased it all. He had loved him. Not because he was dying, but because through her he had lived. Love doesn't always come wrapped in the perfect moment. Sometimes it arrives in ashes and still burns just as bright. John and Mandy never had a wedding. No first dance, no vows beneath chandeliers. But they had truth. They had sacrifice. And in the end, they had love deeper than ceremony. You didn't have to be born into legacy to build one. Mandy was once just the maid, the girl who brought towels and turned down sheets. But in the final chapters of John's life, she became his peace, his voice, his future. He carried a child, yes. But more than that, she carried hope. He carried a name forward, not for the riches it held, but for the redemption it represented. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about others, it's about letting yourself start again. Mandy had almost walked away. The ask was too big, the shame too short. But when she forgave him, not just for the proposition, but for his silence, his fear, his brokenness, she opened a door neither of them expected. A door to new beginnings. To something worth fighting for. Healing doesn't erase the past, it redefines it. Gunn didn't get a second life. But in his final months, he rewrote his story. He'd die a cold CEO, with no heir. He died a man in love, a father, a husband in everything but title. Mandy didn't bury him with regret. He honored him with grace. Years later, Mandy stood on the grand steps of Lily Hill, dressed in a soft linen dress, watching as Aiden ran through the fields, chasing butterflies with the carefree joy his father never had. Visitors often came now, orphans from the children's center John had funded anonymously, families from the town he once ignored. Mandy had opened the gates wide. Because Lily Hill didn't belong to power anymore. It belonged to purpose. One Evie tugged at her skirt. "Mom?" he asked softly, pointing to the framed photo in the hallway. "Was he nice?" Mandy smiled through misty eyes. "He was scared," she whispered, "but he loved better than anyone I've ever known." And that was enough. If this story touched you, if you've ever lost someone squat, or loved, if you believe that healing can begin in the most broken places, leave a comment below with a cut to honor someone you've loved and lost. Share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. You've skipped for more stories that remind us, even in the darkest nights, love writes the final line.